Hi guys, and welcome to another edition of The Kevin Moore Show, which is sponsored by channeling.com. Now on today's show, I'm about to be joined by my guest, John Alexander. Now this interview was taped in Las Vegas in June of this year, 2019, in person. And you're just going to see listen to the audio part. There is some video with it. And this is an uncut version of the interview. And obviously in some parts I'm talking rather loudly just so that John can hear me. And again, this is for an upcoming, potential docuseries on Bob Lazar, looking at it from a different perspective. And I thought, well, it'll be interesting to release this right now because there's some fascinating stuff that this man has to say. So, just to give you a bit of background on John Alexander, he holds a Ph.D. He was an Army colonel when he retired and went to Los Alamos National Laboratory. Now, for over 5 decades, he's studied intensively various phenomena, including UFOs, remote viewing, near-death experiences, psychokinesis, and others. Now, he's met with shamans all over the world, and his most recent book is Reality Denied, First-Hand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen But Did. So enjoy my interview with John.
My name is John Alexander. I'm a retired military senior officer, combat experience in Vietnam as a commander and in Afghanistan. I'm second career was Los Alamos National Laboratory, and finally works in private aerospace.
I so appreciate you coming on, so thank you for coming on. So this is going to be based around the Bob Lazar documentary that we're working on right now. Right. So obviously you've got a very interesting background. You've worked in would you say government? It's government work that you've done for most of your career?
About half a century, yeah.
Half a century of government work. So you've obviously signed the Secrecy Act. You can't talk about some aspects of your work, right?
Almost all of it's totally open.
Is that right?
Certainly.
Okay. So if you could sort of break it down, what have you actually worked on? What have you actually done with your career? Because I'm sure it's fascinating, some of the stuff.
Well, don't know where to start with that. Like I say, with special operations, intelligence, research and development. My last assignment on active duty was Director of Advanced System Concepts for the Army, which then had a laboratory command. Retired, went to Los Alamos National Laboratory. There, as you know, we developed the field of non-lethal weapons in particular. After retiring from Los Alamos, came to Las Vegas under Bob Bigelow and forming NIDS, National Institute for Discovery Science, where we just worked on a lot of very strange projects. His interest in 2 areas, one is UFOs and the other one is continuation of consciousness after death.
I've seen you at some of the UFO conferences in the past, right? So where does your work connect to the UFO side of things?
Oh, well, that's a different question. While I was still on active duty, I created what became known as the Advanced Theoretical Physics Working Group, TS-SCI level program specifically to look at UFOs. We had participants from all of the services, from various intelligence agencies and from aerospace, all of whom had, the appropriate clearances and all of that. And that continued from about 83 time frame until I retired in 88. We actually had later meetings at Los Alamos.
What's your take on the UFO phenomena?
Well, as you know, I wrote a book called UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, Realities. The first line of the book that I wrote is, UFOs are real. That said, it ends with a paragraph, I'll paraphrase, it basically says, whatever this is, it is more complex than we could ever imagine, and that we are not at the point of asking the right questions, that much less getting simplistic answers, and I don't think there'll be any simple answers.
I know when our community talks about disclosure, I think that's just like a fable. Do you know what I mean? It's just, it's never going to happen in our lifetime.
In the conferences, I say disclosure has happened and happened and happened. Basically, all governments. I mean, you look at, we've had 3 presidents who've been involved. You know, Reagan chased a UFO. Carter reported one. So, you know, we've been saying, Truman said, hey, this is real back in the, you know, 1940s with things flying over Washington. So when you say not disclosure, and then you look at all of the other countries who have been involved saying, here's our documents, many of the ones from the government, either you can go on the CIA website, for instance, and find many of the documents. You can go to the Air Force down at Maxwell Air Force Base and get all the Blue Book reports that are there. So my question to those who say, when's disclosure going to happen? And I haven't seen that since today, earlier. You know, what do you mean disclosure?
So you feel that disclosure has been happening and it continues to happen?
There's different types of disclosure, if you will. Mine is the reality of UFOs, and you keep hearing that the government denies reality. That's never been the case since the 1940s. We've talked about the reality of them, so that's not the issue. What some people are looking at, well, there's actually a Gallup poll that was done globally, and it runs from the people who I call skeptics or debunker kinds of things through say, okay, UFOs are real, and at the far end of the spectrum is a pretty substantial percent of the population is ET is alive and well and walking among us. And I think some of the disclosures want to, if you look at all of the stuff that's out there, rumors and whatnot, they talk about interactions between, you know, government officials and ET, other occupants, and I come down strongly against that.
So when some people like, let's use example, Travis Walton, you've met Travis Walton. Yeah. Do you feel that he had a genuine abduction experience?
Oh, no, we're talking about very different things here. I understand we jumped categories. One, it talks about government disclosure of, you know, ET contact. Have people been abducted? Most likely. But you've got to remember that these have been reported throughout the entirety of human history in every culture, and so that they fly in little tin, you know, vehicles is just the new wrinkle on a very, very old story.
Wow, that's so interesting the way that you put this information across. So going back to government disclosure, what do you think the government makes of the phenomena?
Mostly they don't care. Now the flap at the moment is that, as Lou Alessandro says, thinks they should care. I kind of used to be in that same camp and have now said I'm not sure this is a government program, or that you necessarily want the government involved in UFOs. What they bring to the table is some very advanced sensors, some very good brain power, taken with national labs and things of that nature. But they also bring a propensity to classify everything, and so getting the information out. And sometimes for very good reasons. While I said we have very good sensors, what probably classified about it is just how good those sensors are. What are the operational parameters? That's more. Now, you also don't like things you can't explain, and so they've had, as you know, a series of cases. But this has gone, you know, since at least of the 40s, and actually before that with Foo Fighters and things like that we have encountered things in the air that don't have any quick or rational explanation. The government and management in general does not like things you can't have an answer to.
You know, I find it very interesting what you say when you say that, you know, the true nature of what this phenomena may be is so deep, is so out of our understanding or conception that, do you think it kind of tears into the fabrication of a spiritual side as well?
Oh yes, and it is my contention that consciousness is a key component. And in most of my briefings, I start out with a slide that says, let's talk about a variety of phenomena. UFOs and abductions are part of that. But as you know, I've worked with near-death experiences. I used to be the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Kubler-Ross, if you know her, was the head of my committee when I did my dissertation. Have worked in postmortem communications and psychokinesis. The work we've done with shamans all over the world that defy the laws of physics, particularly laws of thermodynamics, standing in fire, sitting in fire, eating fire, spontaneous healing, etc., etc. It is my conjecture that these things are interrelated and that UFOs are kind of a piece of that.
Could be interdimensional, for example. They could be interdimensional.
Oh, yeah, you run the host of things. I do have a problem. I do come down against the ETH, or extraterrestrial hypothesis. You know, little gray guys from Zeta Reticuli flying in. And the reason I come down against is not that it couldn't happen, but it's just too simple. I mean, if you look at, I start with the premise of what do you mean by a UFO? Because I got little balls of light. I've got craft that are, you know, miles across and thousands of variations in between. So if you come out with the ETH, you say, wait a minute, is Earth on the galactic bucket list of places you have to visit? Because you have so many visitors coming along, let alone that, oh, by the way, they come a gazillion miles and they got to go to the White House? Or, you know, stop in the US or, you know, wherever it is. It's a global phenomena, and it just defies common sense that it's simply, you know, now, if the question is, does ET exist? Absolutely. There's no, and that's pure math. That's not wishful thinking. But you know, when you look at the estimates that have risen from a couple of, you know, we started with one or two potential for Earth-like planets someplace out there, and we're now talking in hundreds of billions. And that number keeps rising almost exponentially the longer that we study the issue of the potential for life. And that's just straight, like I say, math and physics and biology.
You know, I've interviewed many different people in the sort of metaphysical world, and some people nowadays, some of the deeper thinkers are saying, you know what, there's different layers of reality, and where these crafts are coming from, what these things are, it's not this reality, it's something else. It's something far deeper than we can understand right now.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
And if you look at, there's a key component to what you just said, and that is that the phenomena have morphed over time. And what you don't see are these big leaps. Rather, if you go back in the 1800s, you hear of craft that are floating in the sky and whatnot, and kind of well beyond technology at the time. We didn't have flight then. And what you see is the technologies that are described are a little bit in advance, not 1,000 years, but a bit, but well within our ability to comprehend or imagine it.
Why is the UFO subject important, do you think? Why should we care about it?
It depends on who you mean by you. I find it absolutely intriguing. What you should know is that, you know, for most of the population, general population, probably 70% or higher in all things, believe that it's a real phenomena. But there's a tiny subset who take an intense interest in it, particularly people who've had experiences. Even some of those say, wow, that was interesting, but, and just go on with their daily life. And therein is a large part of the issue of, what's biting you today. What are your alligators? You got to eat, keep the kids, feed, and all of these sorts of things. It's only a very small percentage of the population that have this very, very intense interest, but many of them are very, intensely involved in it, some for personal reasons and others not. And as I said, when it gets into why should you study it, I have argued, we're going to get into some very fundamental issues here, and that is the difference between materialism and the potential for a spiritual world. You raised that issue before. As you know, I've worked with shamans a lot. And in the West, if you believe in a spiritual world, there's a spirit world and the real world that are separate and distinct. When I work with shamans, they move seamlessly, in between these sorts of things and totally accept the reality of a spiritual world, spiritual entity. I do think that these things make sense and ought to be examined. Problem in the West, with our materialistic viewpoint, we assume that there's, quote, a God particle or something like that. We have the Large Hadron Collider, spent billions and billions of dollars on that, and you get down to the Higgs boson, and then after you found that, whoops, there's petaquarks beyond that, and it keeps getting smaller. And their assumption is that you will eventually get to the fundamental block that will build. That does not account for the kinds of phenomena. Now, as I said, we've put about 17 billion into that, and the issue there is that it's really of intense interest to a tiny, tiny subset of particle physicists. Contrarily, if you look at continuation of consciousness, i.e. life after death, meaning that ought to be of interest to 100% of the population, and when you get into the amount of money that we put into that, my best guess, and people have kind of agreed to it, if you take all these phenomena together on a global basis, best guess is about $10 million a year, which is a pittance when you compare it. And yet, this is not putting your money where the interest ought to lie.
Yes, and it could make changes to society if we did want to look from that perspective a little bit more. It would come more from love, that is for certain, and that the only answer sometimes is love. Well,
I use Brazil as a specific example because I've done a lot of work. I just came back from Brazil, and again, most of it is in non-lethal weapons or weapons and dealing at very, very high levels. We're talking people in the secretariat and that kind of level folks who are very well educated and have gone to schools that are based on the Western paradigm and all that. That said, they also integrate spiritism, which is part and parcel of the culture. So dealing with the spirit world, and have been able to integrate those in ways that we don't see in the U.S. and the West in general, Europe and whatnot.
Now, you worked at Los Alamos for how many years?
I was there from 88 to 95.
What was your sort of main job there over the many years? I'm sure it changed, but what sort of pattern did you have job-wise?
Job-wise, I guess program manager would be the easiest way to describe it. I went in and in 1990, the world was changing dramatically, and as it was with the national labs, because the primary focus of Los Alamos, Sandia, and Livermore, of course, were nuclear weapons, and it was a nuclear weapons lab, which counterintuitive. I came along with the concept of non-lethal weapons from a military perspective, and I had looked at the invasion in Panama, certainly Grenada, in which we had overwhelming force, and saying, we need to have the ability to project and apply force without necessarily killing large numbers of people. Remember, a Hispanic community comes from big families with long memories. And so, you're really creating new cycles of violence, if you will, there. So it seemed like it was prudent to come up with alternative systems that go far beyond, the tasers and rubber bullets and that, but how can you go after a nation state and take down the infrastructure in ways that you can bring it back up again. So that was the area that I worked on.
And I'm told that there were probably over 500 people plus that were working there at any one time?
At Los Alamos? Well, we had about 10 to 11,000. That's total.
So 10 to 11,000 people were working at Los Alamos at any one time?
That's kind of standard thing.
A lot of people?
Yeah.
Yeah. So shifting my question back a bit, because I'm going to edit this in a sequence. So obviously with the UFO phenomena and the UFO community as such, it always attracts lots of frauds. It always attracts people who are just dishonest, it seems to.
I'm not, I'd agree with that. It attracts a wide range of people. And that's because the people who have had experiences, come from across the spectrum of society. It does, in the community, in fact, attract its fair share of wingnuts. And again, one of my slides says, there are no lower limits. I don't care how crazy a story you can come up with, you will find people who believe it. And unfortunately, in these areas and the conferences, crazy sells. I mean, that's where you get your highest concentration of interest in people.
Now, obviously, there's the people like Corey Goode, David Wilcock, Emery Smith, that all got their, stories that they've worked in government departments. Well, David Wilcock not so much, but Corey Goode, has had contact, and he was on a 20 and back program, and there's all sorts of people out there with different stories. But if we go to the Bob Lazar story and just concentrate on the Bob Lazar story for a moment, when did you first hear of the Bob Lazar story?
Well, I'm not sure. I've heard the rumors and whatnot, and I was later aware of the work that George Knapp had done with the reports that came out. I can't say. It's just sort of been there for probably since the inception, because I was tied into. I was a member of MUFON and had been following this. Might mention, we haven't talked about the SSE, the Society for Scientific Exploration, but had been a member of that even before I left the military. So my interest in the area, my actual interest in the area goes back to the 40s, but that I got in a position to be able to explore these later. So exactly when any particular rumor comes in there, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it'd be early after the inception.
When did you start looking into the Bob Lazar story in a sense of, to look at whether the story was genuine or not?
Well, it didn't make a lot of sense. And I've recently seen Jeremy's film, and the explanation on that is a little different from what I heard, and it was how Bob supposedly was recruited to go out to Area 51 and that. And actually approaches in the book. The story that I had heard originally is that he had a jet car, which is real, and there was articles about it in the local paper, and that Dr. Teller, who is in fact was a personal friend of mine, we can document that, that Ed, as he called him, was leaning against the thing and reading the paper and saw the story and somehow waved a wand and said, oh, you've got to bypass all of the security clearance operations that normally take months to years, and we're going to plunk you out here and give you the crown jewels. And again, it just didn't make sense. As I said, I know a lot about research and development. I had, as I said, as the director of advanced system concepts, I was very much up on the cutting edge of Army technologies and whatnot. And there were just so many things that just didn't make a lick of sense that you did start looking. And as you well know, the problems with education and where and when it just falls apart on its face.
So with Dr. Tellinger, I believe that he couldn't lean against the wall, for example. When Bob says, he was leaning up or wherever.
Yeah, that's kind of minor. It's true. Prosthetics have changed considerably, particularly in recent years, but most people didn't know that in Hungary as a teenager he had slipped and fallen under a trolley car and had his lower leg was traumatically amputated. I had Dr. Teller over for dinner personally to talk about these topics. I did ask him about Lazar, and he goes, who? I mean, it's certainly not on his radar. I might mention I also know Teller's proteges. They call him Dr. Teller. Nobody calls him Ed.
So when you had Dr. Tellinger with you on that night, he denied ever knowing Bob, and he had never given Bob any access to some program at S4.
Oh, he just didn't know who or what I was talking about in that topic. We had him over and wanted to kind of introduce him to the UFO topic, and we were showing him videos and whatnot. I'm not sure which, this happened on several occasions, and one of them I did have Hal Putoff up to introduce Dr. Teller to zero-point energy, which is very interesting. So I'm not sure if it was that night or another night, but we were specifically talking about UFOs, was interested, but no specific, information or whatnot. And basically, one of the big things he said is you're looking in the wrong area. And by that he meant you're assuming that telescopes are looking out, and the problem is it's like looking into the heavens through a straw.
So true, so true. So true what he was saying.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But remember, this also indicates a lack, certainly, of comprehension of the broader aspects that we've talked about here, consciousness or interactions or things like that. And
I mean, obviously Bob talks about working at Los Alamos, and there's no reason why he wasn't a contractor there at some point.
Right. Well, I would say, and always that has come up is his name is in the phone book. And that's true, and before we mentioned there were 11,000 people. All of them are in the phone book, and that includes the security guards, the contract workers in the mess hall, the cafeteria workers, everybody whose name is in there. That does not mean, as the difference was, I worked for the University of California, for Los Alamos. So the difference is between working for Los Alamos and working at Los Alamos.
Right. So
That's why I do know that they have made several inquiries, and they say we have no record of them, and they probably would not, because their records are of the University of California people, not everybody. Now, I'll bring up one thing you probably didn't catch. In the movie, he says, if I just came out of high school, why would they hire me? I'm sorry, but we probably did have high school dropouts that would have been there and have their name in the phone book if they're working in the cafeteria. There's no equivalency there.
is it pretty difficult to speak to someone at Los Alamos and say, look, can anybody trace this man down, and why can't we trace this simple person?
Oh, no, that's been done, and the answer is no. And like I say, I think that Stanton was the one who came up with it and said he actually names the contractor that he was working for.
Now, there is a Dr. Krangle who does say that he remembers him being there, but he says he does not know in what capacity, and he could have been a very low capacity that he was there, but he remembers him there. The thing with Bob is he says he's a physicist, but there is no documentation anywhere to prove he's a physicist.
He's a tinkerer, and apparently a pretty good tinkerer. I mean, he has gone out and built some interesting little widgets, starting with going on at that time jet bikes and whatnot. So, yeah, an inventor or tinkerer is very different from being a physicist.
When we have done some investigation into Bob and we spoke to the regressionist who put him under hypnosis, right? The regressionist's take on it was, if they wanted to destroy Bob's credibility, why not take out his certificates so that no one could ever find that he ever went to MIT and any other establishments?
Do you have any idea how difficult that would be? I mean, you have yearbooks, you have, all the professors, the other people who were in the class. It goes on and on. And also, I believe Stan found out that, while he was supposedly at MIT and Caltech bilocating, there was a Bob Lazar at a junior college in California.
Wow. Okay. Yet, there's many people like Jeremy Corbell, for example, who will say, this man's telling the truth.
That is, that's his opinion. And like I say, the facts just do not support that. And they do, even there, acknowledge that there are problems from a records perspective. But they do overstate, like I say, the emphasis on the name and the phone book.
One very interesting thing Bob said at the end of the interview, you picked up on as well. What did Bob say?
Well, at the end, he was, again, this is in Jeremy's film, and he says, well, people ask why I sometimes come up with different stories, and as I recall, it was something like, I just say what comes into my head.
When you look at Bob's story, Bob went to see a hypnosis guy called Lane. Lane took him down a number of times. In some of Bob's transcripts of those conversations, Bob goes into detail about the Greys and the sort of connection they had with us in kind of pushing us in a sort of DNA way, to develop us into these containers that we are now. He spoke about a number of intense things in those regression and hypnosis sessions. And what's your take on Bob under hypnosis? Could Bob have made up that information? And
it's very easy to confabulate under hypnosis. People do that all the time, particularly if they believe it. I've never said he doesn't believe that some of these things happen. He may or may not. I've never met him, by the way. That's just for the record. And by all accounts, a nice guy. But like I say, he came up with enough. I will say that under again, going back to the film, they discuss in some detail about him looking in the window and seeing E.T. there. And the description he goes into in Jeremy's film says, well, maybe it was a doll or something like that. I didn't say it was really an E.T., which I've not heard the tapes as yours one, would be different from, the description that he was.
Well, he talks about a book, and in this book, it was many of the answers to how the technology that he was about to work on came from. And the hypnosis sort of allowed him to get that information out of the book.
Well, let me take a step, more than Lazar, and I do. In fact, I've got what do they call it? A something $1 trillion, I think it was $16 trillion challenge, and wrote that. And the point is that if we have this as an alternative energy capability, having little tin cans that fly around would be fairly minor compared to what you would do for changing the energy system of the world and the geopolitical situation in which we find ourselves now. Matter of fact, in one of my books, I addressed this is a straight weapons book, but in geopolitics, using a system called prolepsis, but the issue was, how do we get out of this mess? And the point was that if you had alternative energy systems, you could make the Middle East irrelevant. And yet, that kind of drives the train here. So, certainly if we had such a capability, it would have been used in that venue, not just to fly widgets.
Well, they say that, Bob says that those widgets weren't as. There were, for some reason, 7 crafts there that different compartmentalized scientists or physicists were working on, and his happened to be the energy amplifiers. And again, none of this can be proved. It's just his take on it.
But it also says E.T. has not even mastered the technology that we have today in collision avoidance. I mean, remember, he said there's 9 craft there. Now, one hypothesis, these are gifts, but then you have to say, why us? Again, if you're looking at a E.T. from a global perspective, logic just kind of falls apart.
Well, unless it was some sort of exchange program like humans for disc craft, but still it makes no sense. Makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, again, the fundamental issue, in my view, is energy. And if you had this capability, even if I assume the story is real, and I come down against Roswell, gets me in a lot of trouble, but that we got one and we were working on it, all of the people that support that theory that I respect come down and say, we have no idea what it is. We have not been able to reverse engineer it. And yet you have the whole ARV group that says, and Lazar would be in there, hey, we're flying these things around. So you're well past, just simple reverse engineering in that scenario.
Well, when you look at Roswell, and that's thank you for bringing that up. But when you look at Roswell, when you look at someone like Don Schmidt, who did the book The Day After Roswell, he met a lot of first-hand witnesses that were there at the crash recovery, or some people that knew people that were there as well. How do you where do you put those witnesses in regards to a case like that not being true?
Yeah. Across the board. Well, first of all, in my view, something very unusual happened at Roswell. I don't doubt that at all. I think the government went in and was probably very heavy-handed in cleaning up the mess. I have talked to people who I think were either involved or certainly knew what was going on, that they had material. Now, the material is, I think, kind of the key piece. And surprisingly, Bill Burns may be a guy who has the video, because he had two people, including Jesse Marcel Jr., who I believe did have his hands on some material, and another sergeant, and both of these guys who have since died, but they laid out a series of thin films, asked them, do you see this stuff here? Anything that looks, and they both pointed to the same piece. And it existed, and it had all of the properties that Jesse Sr. said couldn't have existed, but they did in that time. That is, metal with a memory, and it could withstand deformation and return to its original condition. It was resistant to fire, extraordinarily light. All of those properties, and all of that existed in 1947.
Why would someone like Bob Lazar carry the lie on that he has? If this story is not true, which with a lot of the people I've spoken to, including his ex-wife Tracy, who says it is not true, well, she never said it's not true, she wouldn't say, but the hints that she gave me says everything. Why would Bob want this attention?
I have no idea. Again, my UFO book, I have a second chapter in there called The Corso Conundrum. And I know Phil Corso wrote the day after Roswell. And the question I cannot answer with him is why. I can suspect it. Now, in Lazar's case, of course, he cried all the way to the bank. Because remember, Roswell did come out with the Lazar UFO thing. So why people do these things, people are stranger than anything. That's just the way it is.
That is true. There was one question from that, it's just left my mind. Well, I could ask that, yeah. Obviously, John Lear feels that the story is true. He's very upset right now that I should even question the story. He was with Bob all the way along, with no proof, yeah. And again, he's entitled to believe what he wants to believe, but shouldn't it be the case of prove it?
You know, John's a nice guy and very interesting, but he told me flat out that anybody with a laptop computer can prove we never went to the moon. And I know 3 of the lunar astronauts, personally. And they say, gee, I thought I was there. And he's also told us about the ocean coming under where we're sitting here in Nevada now. And the submarine base in Nevada, where you go down in a thing and the submarine goes out into the Pacific Ocean. John believes lots of things. If you want the cute story, I might mention I was giving at the National Atomic Testing Museum, giving a presentation, and he did show up literally in a tinfoil hat.
What do you think of the idea that, what if Bob did experience something? What if Bob had a true experience and was placed where he was so that, one, he can be easily disproved because he's got a very wild background with prostitutes and other issues that he's got, right? Mm. And it really
placed by whom or what?
Well, the government, for wanting to get this information out.
It still makes no sense.
Nor to me. This was John's idea.
Yeah, I just placed there. You got to ask by whom. And if you look at the procedure, how things work, getting clearances and things, very, very difficult, and certainly not the waving the wand that he described. And
many people say that when you look at the legacy of Bob Lazar, he put Area 51 on the map. He put S4 on the map. Well,
actually, that's George Knapp, by repeating the story and out there. Because I had heard of Area 51 before, but it was like whispered. It was not something that was in the general public consciousness, and through the Lazar story coming out and the things that he did. Now, I always say, don't be surprised that strange things fly in the desert. As you may know, one of my friends was Ben Rich. Ben was the second director of the Skunk Works, and we also discussed these things in fair detail. We know how Kelly Johnson came up with, finding the area out there and what they were doing. Most of it were there unidentified objects, yeah. A lot of it had to do with threat identification, where we had captured material, and remember, this goes back to the bad old days, and did not want the Soviets to know that we had some of their aircraft and we could fly them. And the reason for doing that is to find out what the vulnerabilities are and what the signatures are and all of those sorts of things, as well as the development of our own stealth technology, which is basically signal suppression, and running those against our senses. And is that very sensitive? You better believe that is very, very sensitive information.
When you listen to the transcripts, I've looked at the transcripts of Bob's hypnosis session, one of Bob's sessions, and it's like he's almost connecting with the superconscious mind. He's almost connecting to something that's bigger than him, that's purposefully giving him information that could be true.
But it depends on what you mean by could be true. I talk about universal mind and that there is total interconnectedness throughout the universe. I don't think there's anything such as IP. And that's because you can go in and extract data. Where this all comes from, and one of the hypotheses is that there's a big supercomputer out there someplace in the ether, and that people do tap into it. You get into near-death experiences, that's one of the explanations, if you will, or for past life regressions, that you didn't really have that regression, but you were able to tap into, say, what's known as the Akashic record or something of that nature, and extracting those data.
And when you look at this hypothesis, this idea of connecting to a superconscious mind, well, what if some of these people, like Travis Walton, like Bob Lazar, are actually working with some sort of team, some sort of group of something not understandable on this level, but something else that's pushing them to think that what they're doing is right, but they're actually trying to get disclosure.
Do you know Andrea Puharich?
No.
No.
Well,
Andrea goes way, way back. He's the guy who brought Uri Geller to the U.S. And remember, one of the big things that they had that ties into this directly is the nine.
I suppose what I'm trying to say is this whole phenomena, stick with Bob Lazar for a moment, that he really feels he's had this experience, right? He may be lying about some of it, but he really feels this happened to him. What is pushing him to do that? Would we be surprised, would you be surprised, that there is some group beyond this reality that's working with people to push them into this direction?
Well, that's hardly a new concept. Jacques Sarfati, I argue with him all the time, and he talks about many, many years ago getting this voice, leaving voicemails for him, this metallic voice and whatnot. And so the idea that there are people on the other side, and this gets into a range of other phenomena as well, particularly when you get into postmortem communication. If you're dealing with spirit entities, and that just opens up a whole new spectrum, if you will. But the potential that there are people who can do, well, they're now, some of the NDEs are now being called spiritual transformation experiences. And some of them talk about just an expansive awareness that transforms how they behave here, and others talk about the potential for folks on, quote, the other side who wish to help and do communicate. Yeah, you know Chico Xavier? I mean, that the work is being done in Brazil, and Chico put out millions and millions of books. He wrote, of course, he claims that he never wrote any of them, that these are all psychographs, i.e. this is material that is funneled through him. Gasparetto, what they were doing with artwork, similar sorts of things, saying they're channeling, famous artists, and you take their material and look at it, and it changes over time, so it's not like learning how to replicate a single individual, but you have these people, providing information, and in this case, physically, the work I talk about in Reality Denied, where I watch these people with a planchette just scribble, and then all of a sudden go, and this whole picture materializes from what you thought was scribbling.
Do you believe in the idea that people can channel?
I've seen it. No, I do talk in Umbanda. We were at the conference in Curitiba in Brazil and saw my wife get fully possessed. And while they're used to seeing people get possessed, they're not used to seeing gringos out there whirling on the floor, literally a showstopper. There were about 300 folks there. It was a big Umbanda center, and literally stopped the show. So, yeah, and we've worked a lot with ayahuasca and other shamans and whatnot. So,
One final question. You talked very early on about Bigelow. Now, did Bigelow, or do you know that Bigelow invested money into Bob Lazar, or Bob Lazar and Bigelow formed a company together?
No, I know there's some connection, but exactly what it is, and that's, I'm sure, done through George.
What would you want, John, your legacy to be in this field? What do you want your legacy to be?
Mine? Oh, I say that quite clearly. I'm trying to make it permissible for credible senior scientists to get involved without risking their reputation or livelihood. I just sent Bill Nye a nastygram, the science guy. If you saw him, but Sunday, just yesterday, he was on with Brian Steltler, and Brian brought up the UFO thing, and he just gave an answer that was total nonsense. I mean, he had no idea of the fact. He's saying, well, it must be the Air Force. These are Navy guys, so therefore it's the Air Force flying things around to screw them out. I mean, and the problem of them, spouting off, who has the reputation in the field, and this has been an issue. One of the things that comes up is the creation of NIDS and the board that was there. And I was able to bring in a number of people who would normally not have been exposed to these sorts of things. But most of them said, I'm interested, but, I don't want my name out there, in the file. And so you have a stigma that's attached to it, and hopefully that will change. One of the things I point out is that what we're dealing with is at least as complex as cancer. And my approach to it is we need something like the Human Genome Project on steroids, meaning you have multiple countries, multiple universities, and most importantly, sharing of data. And under the current auspices, you can't do that, and you risk your livelihood. If you're a scientist and openly admit being involved in these fields. I talk about Bob John, who was the dean of School of Engineering at Princeton, and still got pillified. And even after he died, they came after him because he dealt with strange things. And credentials are absolutely impeccable.
And we should have facts to back things up as well sometimes. There should be some evidence to back things up.
Yeah.
Well, John Alexander, just thank you so much for your time today.